Welcome to the wonderfully disgusting world of medieval hygiene, an era where hygiene was more of a suggestion than a necessity. Bathing was optional, and communal toilets were a social event. Personal space didn't exist, mainly because it was hard to tell where you ended and where the filth around you began. Welcome to the stench, where soap is suspicious, water is treacherous, and cleanliness is a sin. To fully appreciate the triumphs of modern hygiene, running water, flush toilets, deodorant that doesn't double as bear repellent, it helps to take a long, unblinking look into the festering latrine pit of the Middle Ages. This was a time when humanity bravely chose filth over freshness, convinced that bathing too often might result in death, madness, or worst of all, sensual pleasure. Cleanliness was, in a sense, next to heresy. The Middle Ages, roughly 500 to 1500 AD, were not one long, unwashed nightmare, but they came close. The fall of the Roman Empire had flushed a great deal of plumbing knowledge down the metaphorical toilet. Though, as will be discussed later, that toilet was usually a wooden bench with a hole in it, cantilevered over an open sewer and possibly the kitchen. While some Romans had enjoyed heated baths and scented oils, medieval Europeans instead perfected the art of ignoring odours until their noses gave up entirely. To be clear, many medieval people didn't avoid cleanliness out of sheer laziness or a desire to smell like a compost heap. They believed it was the moral thing to do. Monks, for instance, often considered frequent bathing to be a sign of vanity and spiritual weakness. One influential monastic rulebook recommended that monks bathe once a year, preferably on Easter. Any more than that, and people might start calling them fancy. This wasn't just a religious hang-up. Physicians, those brave scholars armed with leeches, Latin, and guesses, insisted that warm water opened the pores and let bad humours in. These humours were not jokes, but bodily fluids, and the medieval body was believed to be a delicate sack of four: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Maintaining a balance of these fluids was key to health, and bathing was considered a reckless gamble that might upset this internal stew and cause you to die of, say, moist lungs. Furthermore, medieval people didn't believe dirt was inherently bad. In fact, in a world without antibacterial soap, sterile gauze, or any understanding of microbiology, visible grime was often considered a kind of armour. Clean skin was exposed skin. Dirty skin was protected by a crust of God-given filth and possibly some lice. Despite the general reluctance to bathe, soap did exist. The bad news is that it was terrible. Medieval soap was not the charming, lavender-infused bar you buy at a farmer's market and forget in your guest bathroom. No, it was a crude concoction of animal fat and lye, a caustic substance capable of dissolving not only dirt but also dignity. Making soap was a noble art practiced by people who could no longer smell anything. It involved rendering fat, reed boiling down animal remains until they wept grease, mixing it with lye, extracted from ashes, and then letting the mixture age until it became hard enough to scrub a stable. The result was a brick of abrasive, vaguely rancid sludge with the cleaning power of an insult and the scent of despair. That said, people did use it, occasionally grudgingly, and more often for laundry than for bodies. This made sense, as one's tunic might benefit from a lye-based scouring, while one's skin might not enjoy chemical burns and exfoliation via sandpaper. One might imagine that if soap was a hard sell, at least water would be easier. After all, it falls from the sky and doesn't actively attack you, But here too, the medieval mind saw danger. Clean water was suspicious. For one thing, it was rarely clean. Urban rivers were used for drinking, washing, and disposing of things one didn't want to keep around: dead animals, rotten food, and the occasional unwanted houseguest. Posthumously. Wells could be safer, but were also breeding grounds for bacteria. Not that anyone knew what those were. People just noticed that sometimes, after drinking clear water, they exploded from both ends and died. Thus, the safest way to consume water was to turn it into beer. Beer, low in alcohol, high in bacteria-killing boil time, became the hydration method of choice. This meant that medieval peasants were more or less drunk all the time, which may help explain everything else. Bathing in water was no less risky. Public bathhouses, when they existed, offered tubs of communal stew that could transfer lice, scabies, and syphilis with shocking efficiency. Private baths were a luxury, requiring not just hot water, but servants to lug it, tubs to hold it, and the foolhardy courage to sit naked in warm liquid in the dead of winter. Many homes had no facilities for bathing at all, and the closest thing to personal hygiene might be a damp rag and a prayer. For centuries, the idea of daily washing was associated not with health, but with suspicion. Why are you so clean? What are you trying to hide? Clothing, too, was weaponized in the war against cleanliness. The idea of changing clothes daily or even weekly would have been laughable. Most people had 2 sets of garments, one for wearing and one for mending while wearing the other. Undergarments might be washed occasionally. Overgarments were rarely cleaned and often stood up on their own after years of layering dirt and body oil. Perfume offered a kind of olfactory illusion of hygiene, like spraying cologne on the corpse. Rosewater, musk, and herbal tinctures were used liberally by the upper classes to disguise both bodily and environmental stench. A noble might go months without touching soap and water, but if they smelled of violets and vinegar, it was assumed they were refined. And yet, within all this squalor, there was variation. Peasants who lived near streams might bathe more often out of sheer convenience, while townsfolk had to contend with open sewage, urban overcrowding, and neighbours emptying chamber pots out the window. Ironically, the lower classes were sometimes cleaner than the rich, if only because they lacked the luxury of being comfortably disgusting. Despite this aversion to water, people still performed a kind of hygiene theatre. Hands and face were often washed upon rising. Hair might be combed to remove lice, not style. Teeth might be picked with twigs, and nails occasionally trimmed with knives intended for cheese. None of this made anyone clean by modern standards, but it kept bodies functional enough to keep ploughing, praying, or pillaging. Monasteries, ever the exception to rules they often invented, sometimes kept elaborate washing rituals, especially before meals and prayer. But this had more to do with spiritual purification than hygiene. Washing one's hands was a nod to God, not germs. There were even bathing days declared by cities or guilds, often annual, possibly coinciding with festivals, and almost certainly ignored. People might gather at rivers or bathhouses to slough off a year's worth of grime in one glorious itchy orgy of scrubbing. For a brief, shining moment, they were clean. Then they put their clothes back on and ruined everything. The dirt of the poor was seen as natural, even virtuous. The dirt of the rich was hidden behind silk and scent, or explained away by divine right. Either way, filth became a kind of social signal. If you smelled like dung, it meant you worked. If you smelled like jasmine and slightly less dung, it meant you ruled. Medieval medicine even argued that different classes had different humours. The peasant, full of bile and earthiness, was naturally more robust. The noble, delicate, and prone to melancholy couldn't be expected to bathe lest he shatter like a glass tulip. So the great irony of medieval hygiene is that nobody really thought they were dirty. They thought everyone else was. It was always the neighbour, the tanner, the peasant downwind. The problem was not the open sewer under your own floorboards. It was the fishmonger's wife who reeked of actual fish. Of course, all the dirt in the world has to go somewhere. And in the medieval world, that somewhere was usually down. Down into ditches, down into rivers, down into basement pits that hadn't been emptied since the invention of shoes. Medieval hygiene wasn't just a matter of what you did to your body. It was also about what you did with your body's, let's say, byproducts. Which brings us to the beating, bubbling heart of medieval sanitation, the toilet. Or rather, the enthusiastic absence of one. Because if you thought bathing was bad, wait until you learn where all that unwashed meat and boiled cabbage ended up. Spoiler, it's often where the food came from in the first place, so prepare yourself. Tighten your nose, lift your robes, and whatever you do, don't look down. Medieval toilets, garderobes, and the art of pretending this is fine. Having waded through the tepid waters of medieval bathing habits, brief, infrequent, and suspect, we now descend into a more pungent abyss, the world of medieval toilets, or as they were more commonly known, holes, occasionally wooden, sometimes stone, rarely dignified, and never, ever flushed. It's easy to assume that human waste management in any era follows a logical progression. Dig a hole, relieve yourself, bury it, move on. The Middle Ages took this framework, discarded the move on, and sometimes the bury it, and instead focused on the noble tradition of dropping things out of windows and letting God sort it out. In castles, monasteries and towns alike, waste disposal was less of a system and more of a hope. And hope, as it turns out, is not biodegradable. The garderobe, throne of regret. Let's begin at the top of the social pile, literally, with a castle toilet, known as the garderobe. From a distance it had the appearance of architectural wisdom. A small stone protrusion high up on a castle wall, like a tiny balcony with delusions of grandeur. Inside, a narrow seat with a strategically placed hole allowed the user to defecate straight down the side of the building. Below, a pit, or a moat, or a pile, depending on the builder's ambition and the local willingness to shovel. The word garderobe translates helpfully to guarding one's robes. This is because garments were often hung in or near the toilet shaft, as the constant updraft of ammonia-rich air was believed to deter lice, and it probably did. It's hard to imagine a louse sticking around when the wind smells like fermented duck stew and regret. Garderobes were cold, dark, windy, and dangerously high above the ground. Some featured multiple seats, presumably for bonding experiences or unfortunate overcrowding. Most were built directly into castle walls, making them architectural weak points, a detail not lost on attackers, who sometimes entered fortresses through the sewage chute. It was, one imagines, the least glamorous kind of infiltration. Public pits and private catastrophes. Outside of castles, things got considerably worse. In cities and villages, where space was tight and dignity was already gone, toilets took the form of communal pits or simple wooden boxes with a hole in the top and denial underneath. These were often placed in backyards or alleyways and emptied only when absolutely necessary, i.e., when they overflowed into someone else's backyard or alleyway. This was called a cesspit, though the name Festival of Biohazards would have also been accurate. Maintenance fell to a noble profession known as the night soil man. Working by cover of darkness and intense personal shame, these individuals would descend into cesspits to remove waste by hand and bucket. It was quite possibly the worst job in human history, and yet someone had to do it. Otherwise, people began to notice the smell, and by notice we mean pass out. The waste was carted outside the city and dumped, ideally in a designated area, more often in a field, sometimes a river. Eventually the fields would be fertilised, the crops would grow, the food would be eaten, and the whole cycle would begin again. A perfect demonstration of medieval sustainability, if you ignored the cholera, portable misery, chamber pots and windowsills. For those who preferred the comforts of indoor plumbing, minus the plumbing, there was the chamber pot. This ceramic bowl of sorrows sat discreetly under the bed or beside the hearth, ready to receive whatever offerings the night might demand. Once filled, the contents had to be disposed of. This is where things got interactive. The standard practice was to toss the waste into the street from the upper window with a yell of "Gardez-l'eau," French for "watch out for the water," which translated more accurately to incoming feces. This charming tradition gave us both a quaint medieval ritual and the etymological roots of the English word loo. Language, like sewage, finds a way. Streets became rivers of filth, gutters overflowed with human waste, animal waste, and anything else that didn't spark joy. In dry weather, it congealed. In wet weather, it flowed. Either way, stepping outside was an act of bravery, especially for anyone in sandals. City ordinances attempted to regulate these activities with all the effectiveness of a wet napkin against a flood. Laws were passed forbidding the dumping of waste into streets, waterways, and neighbours' flower beds. These laws were universally ignored. Enforcement required standing close enough to catch someone in the act, and no one wanted that job. Moats, not just for defence anymore. Back at the castle, moats served a dual function, deterring invaders and collecting sewage. Many garderobes emptied directly into the moat, turning what should have been a defensive water feature into an open-air toilet ring. This arrangement had several downsides, starting with the smell and ending with dysentery. But in the medieval world, priorities were different. A stinking, disease-filled moat was less likely to attract invaders and more likely to repel them with psychological warfare. Some forward-thinking engineers added water flow to their moats, hoping to flush the waste away. In theory, this worked. In practice, the waste travelled downstream to someone else's castle, who then retaliated by dumping their waste upstream. This was the medieval version of diplomacy. Monasteries, being centres of learning, sometimes had what passed for advanced sanitation systems. Cloisters were built with rudimentary plumbing, stone channels that carried waste away from latrines via diverted river water. It was, in concept, a primitive flush toilet. In execution, it was a damp, mossy trench that carried excrement slightly further downhill. Monks adhering to strict routines and even stricter silence perform their ablutions in communal latrines. Long benches with holes spaced evenly, like a grotesque piano. There was no privacy, but at least there was structure. Everyone defecated together in humble harmony, facing a wall and their own mortality. Some monasteries even installed running water systems, with pipes carved from stone or hollowed logs. These innovations were rare, expensive, and prone to freezing. But when they worked, they allowed for a slightly less horrific experience, a revolutionary concept for medieval sanitation. In a world where even the idea of a dedicated toilet was a luxury, toilet paper was not on anyone's shopping list. Instead, the medieval person relied on a range of creative materials, depending on availability, social class, and sheer desperation. The most common solution was the stick, sometimes referred to as a Gompf stick or arswand. It was exactly what it sounds like, a thin, smooth stick used to scrape or prod. These were kept near the latrine, sometimes shared, never cleaned. Yes, it's okay to pause here and scream quietly. Other wiping materials included straw, moss, rags, handfuls of grass, and occasionally the left hand. Not coincidentally, the right hand became the standard for greetings, eating, and virtually all social contact. The left hand, meanwhile, had its own mysterious aura, sullied, shadowed, and never to be shaken. The wealthier classes might use linen or wool rags, which were reused until they were too stiff to fold. Paper existed technically, but was far too valuable for such work. You wouldn't wipe your backside with a Bible unless you were very, very Protestant. Of all the hazards medieval toilets posed, perhaps the most terrifying was the risk of falling in. Cesspits and guardrabes lacked safety features like railings, warning signs, or even a floor that consistently held weight. There are documented cases, sad, hilarious, absolutely disgusting cases of individuals tumbling into latrines and drowning in human waste. These incidents were not confined to the poor. Royalty, too, were not immune. One particularly unlucky nobleman reportedly met his end by slipping into his own castle's cesspit during the night, vanishing beneath the mire and leaving behind only a very confused servant. This wasn't even considered particularly unusual death. Falling into the toilet and dying was just part of the background risk of living in the Middle Ages, like plague or inquisitions. Despite all this, medieval societies occasionally attempted to project an illusion of cleanliness. Wealthy homes might install a privy room, a small chamber with a cushioned seat over a pit. These were rarely cleaned and often vented into the kitchen because architectural logic was still in beta. Some cities experimented with municipal latrines, public toilets built over running water or rivers. London and Paris both had attempts at this, with varying degrees of horror. The basic idea was sound. The execution, as always, came down to maintenance. And maintenance in medieval Europe had roughly the same success rate as witch trials. So yes, medieval sanitation was less a system and more a series of deeply personal betrayals committed by architecture, gravity, and your fellow man. Toilets were not rooms but ideas, fleeting, smelly suggestions that bodily functions were better left to the wind and divine providence. Waste was not so much managed as it was vaguely redirected until it became someone else's problem. But if you thought that was the worst of it, if the idea of sharing a splintered bench over a festering pit has you yearning for modern plumbing, just wait until everyone gets undressed. because as grim as it was to eliminate in the Middle Ages, it was arguably worse to try to clean yourself afterward, which brings us, inevitably, to the bathhouse, a place where hygiene, socialising, and slow-motion infections came together in a warm, sudsy hellscape. So hold your breath and your immune system, because next comes the part where people voluntarily sit in other people's soup. Communal bathing and the rise of itchy decisions. When cleanliness meant soaking in strangers' skin cells and hoping for the best. If you've made it this far, you've likely accepted the crushing reality of medieval sanitation. Toilets were theoretical, sewer systems were more spiritual than functional, and waste management was more of a prayer than a process. So, naturally, one might ask, how did anyone ever get clean? They didn't, but they certainly tried. And that brings us to a particular institution, beloved and feared throughout medieval Europe, the communal bathhouse, a place where the population gathered to undress, unwind and marinate together in what we'll generously call warm water. Imagine a jacuzzi, if jacuzzis were filled with hay, bread, strangers, and a robust catalogue of bacterial cultures. This was hygiene, medieval style, a social event soaked in good intentions and other people's body oil. Communal bathing wasn't a medieval invention. The Romans were already well acquainted with the concept of public nudity and scalding water. But unlike the Romans, who managed their bathhouses with some architectural foresight and aqueducts, medieval bathhouses were more likely to be improvised. Questionably heated wooden tubs in rented rooms next to a butcher. By the 12th century, bathhouses had popped up across towns and cities in Europe. They went by names like stews, which sounds quaint, until you remember stews are things that simmer. And indeed, these bathhouses did plenty of simmering, of both water and moral panic. Initially, the goal was hygiene. Bathing was recommended by medical writers, monks, and people with noses. There was a belief that warm water opened the pores to release bad humours. In practice, it mostly released fleas. Still, people liked the idea, and the bathhouse business was, for a time, positively boiling. What actually happened in a bathhouse? Step 1. Disrobe. Privacy was not part of the experience. Men, women, and occasionally livestock would bathe in the same room, sometimes the same tub, separated only by thin curtains or social awkwardness. For reasons nobody can quite explain, this didn't seem to faze anyone until much later. Step 2. Enter the water. The tub would already be full. Not full of water, mind you, just full. Full of people, full of their hopes, dreams, skin flakes, and whatever fungal situations they brought with them. If you were lucky, the water had been changed that week. If not, you could always float to a clearer section. Step 3. Relax. Bread, beer and cheese were often served at the bathhouse, making it less a hygiene facility and more a pre-modern spa/picnic. Patrons lounged, soaked and gossiped, and because nothing says cleanliness like eating dairy in a damp wooden tub, it was all perfectly medieval. Now you may be wondering, did they use soap? Sort of. Soap in the Middle Ages was less a cleansing agent and more a regional hobby. In some places, lye-based soaps were made with animal fat and ashes, producing a grey, caustic substance that removed dirt, skin, and possibly hope. It was harsh, expensive, and about as gentle as being sandblasted. In wealthier regions, especially Islamic Spain and parts of Italy, olive oil-based soaps became popular and were even perfumed. These were highly coveted and used with alarming restraint. Often reserved for laundering clothes or impressing guests with the illusion of hygiene. In many bathhouses, washing involved a good scrub with rough cloths, handfuls of sand, or simply waiting for the warm water to do its ambiguous work. If you wanted exfoliation, you could request a bath servant to scrape your skin with a blade, a service that doubled as medieval dermatology and sometimes unlicensed surgery. Eventually, problems began to bubble to the surface, chief among them syphilis. Though it didn't make its grand European debut until the late 15th century, the arrival of syphilis sent the entire bathhouse culture into a tailspin. Until then, the only thing you were likely to catch from a shared tub was scabies, ringworm, or a life-shortening rash. But syphilis had star power. It was hideous, painful, and impossible to ignore, even for people who thought bathing twice a year was showing off. The connection between naked group soaking and sexually transmitted misery was not lost on the public. Bathhouses, once symbols of civic pride and questionable nudity, were suddenly recast as dens of sin and disease. Authorities began shutting them down. Clergy started using them as metaphors in sermons. And eventually, the idea of washing communally fell out of favour, replaced by the idea of simply not washing at all. In an impressive feat of historical logic, medieval society concluded that if bathing leads to disease, then filth must be healthy. Thus began an era where cleanliness was associated with weakness and moral corruption, and dirt became the foundation of a sturdy immune system, assuming you lived long enough to enjoy it. There was another problem, of course. When you put a bunch of people in hot water with wine, privacy curtains, and disposable income, things tend to get collaborative. Bathhouses often doubled as brothels, or at least flirted heavily with the idea. Some even offered services that were explicitly not hygienic, unless your idea of cleaning involves deeply personal inspections. In many cases, the line between bath attendant and sex worker was non-existent or negotiable. Authorities did what they always do in these cases, publicly condemn the behaviour while quietly using the facilities themselves. Regulations were passed, decency laws were ignored, and bathhouses kept bubbling. For a while, this dual identity as both hygiene centre and adult entertainment complex was accepted. It was efficient. Why not address both kinds of itch in the same place? But as the Reformation gathered steam and syphilis made its rounds, public opinion shifted. Bathhouses became moral hazards. Sex was rebranded as terrifying, and the idea of communal bathing began to die a slow, itchy death. Not everyone went to bathhouses, of course. The upper classes often had private tubs, wooden barrels lined with cloth and placed in the centre of drafty rooms where one could be both naked and hypothermic. Heated water had to be hauled in by servants, which meant bath night was a production. You didn't take a bath so much as host it. Monks and clergy, who had more time and fewer options, sometimes maintained small bathhouses within monasteries. These were used for spiritual and medical reasons, often accompanied by chants and herbs, because nothing says clean body, clean soul like Gregorian exfoliation. Travelling bathers, yes, this was a profession, would bring tubs to your home, fill them on site, and then take them away. This service was particularly popular with merchants and wealthy households who wanted to bathe without mingling with the public, a sentiment that persists to this day. But the lower classes, they went to the river, or, more commonly, they didn't. Natural bodies of water were the great equalisers. Rivers, lakes and ponds served as drinking sources, washing stations, latrines, and occasionally crime scenes. Washing yourself in a river was free, fast, and only mildly risky to your health. Of course, since the same river might receive waste from 20 upstream households and a tannery, the net result of a good splash in the stream was less clean and more redistributed grime. But it felt fresh, especially compared to the dry, itchy alternative. And let's not forget that medieval Europe was cold, very cold, ice cold. Voluntarily immersing oneself in water, especially in winter, was often viewed as a radical act of religious penance or outright insanity. So for most people, bathing remained an occasional activity. Once a week, if you were lucky. Once a season, if you were honest. As bathing declined, the need to pretend otherwise rose. This ushered in the golden age of lavender-scented lies, the use of perfumes, herbs, and sachets to simulate cleanliness. The wealthy carried pomanders, decorative balls filled with spices and dried flowers, worn like jewellery but meant to mask the scent of a body that had not met water in weeks. Clothing was perfumed, hair was powdered, and rooms were strewn with fragrant herbs. The goal was not to be clean, but to smell like the idea of clean. Lavender, rosemary, and mint were favourites, though anything strong enough to overpower armpits was welcomed. In time, this tradition evolved into entire industries of scented oils, waters, and powders, all designed to distract from the truth. To this day, humanity remains devoted to the illusion of hygiene. We are a species that would rather douse itself in vanilla body spray than confront a damp towel and the consequences of our own skin. The medieval bathhouse was not a complete disaster. It was at times the cleanest place in town. It was social, therapeutic, and for a few glorious waterlogged centuries, genuinely relaxing. It proved that even in an age of filth, people wanted to feel good, smell better, and at least pretend they weren't crawling with lice. Sure, they didn't understand germ theory, or plumbing, or what temperature water needed to be to kill anything. But they tried. And isn't that what really counts? Of course, no amount of soaking could save you from your surroundings. Because while your skin might be scrubbed and perfumed, you still had to walk home through streets coated in waste, under windows that occasionally dumped a chamber pot on your head. Plague perfume and lavender lies. If you can't fight the smell, at least make it fashionable. The medieval world, as we've seen, was a landscape of unimaginable squalor. Streets overflowing with human waste, homes stuffed to the rafters with filth, and an endless supply of disgusting, bodily fluids, all vying for attention. It was an olfactory nightmare, one that could turn even the most experienced nose into a quivering allergic mess. But don't fret, medieval folk had a strategy to counteract the overpowering stench that came with living in a world where hygiene was, at best, a vague suggestion. What was that strategy? Well, it was perfume, lots of it, and not just any perfume. We're talking about plague perfume, a carefully crafted concoction of herbs and spices designed to mask the smell of death, decay, and your own stinky existence. If the medieval period had one universal truth, it was this. When the world smells like sewage and disease, what you really need is a good dose of lavender and rosewater to make everything seem not quite so bad. But here's the catch. This was a world where people didn't know that germs existed. The science of bacteria, viruses, and hygiene was quite frankly beyond their reach, and their noses were suffering for it. So, in their infinite wisdom and desperation, they came up with some truly wild ideas to combat the horrors of their reality. It's no surprise that these were often lavender lies, false beliefs about health, hygiene, and how the world worked that seemed comforting, even though they did nothing to solve the underlying problem. Let's dive into this fragrant fiction and explore how medieval folk tried and failed to make their lives smell a little less like death. If you were a medieval person trying to survive the never-ending assaults of disease and decay, there was one thing you could rely on: lavender. Not only was it the fragrance of the upper crust, or at least that's how it was marketed, but it was also believed to be an antiseptic and a pest repellent. And of course it had the benefit of being readily available and cheap enough to be hoarded by the wealthy and traded by the poor. But what really mattered was that lavender could mask the smell of things like the plague, rotting corpses, and the general stench of humanity after a long day of not bathing. You could be surrounded by piles of decaying bodies in a plague pit, but if you rubbed a little lavender on your wrists, you could at least pretend it was a charming country garden and not the site of an early death. Perfume wasn't just for luxury either. It was a desperate measure to fight the disease that seemed to be lurking everywhere. Physicians, who often looked like they'd just crawled out of a horror movie, wore beak-like masks stuffed with lavender, rose petals, and spices. The idea, of course, was that by inhaling the fragrant herbs, they would be protected from the miasma, a fancy word for bad air, which they wrongly believed was responsible for disease. This belief was rooted in the theory of miasma, the idea that disease was spread through bad air. So if you could just smell something better than the foul air of infected, diseased places, surely that would prevent you from catching whatever awful illness was ravaging the population. The physicians would waddle around in their bird-like outfits, clutching their aromatic beak masks and hoping the plague would pass them by. And while the mask did a great job of blocking out smell, it did little to stop the actual diseases they were dealing with. Meanwhile, for the regular person, lavender wasn't just reserved for medical emergencies. It was used in everyday life as a way to mask not just the death and decay, but also personal hygiene problems. Because let's face it, if you had to choose between a plague and taking a bath, you'd probably opt for the plague. Bathing, after all, was a whole process that involved getting undressed, possibly going to a communal bath where germs were everywhere, and then risking an even greater problem, the humiliation of public exposure. Instead, it was easier to rub some lavender oil behind your ears, sprinkle a little on your clothes, and hope that nobody would notice you'd been living in a cesspit for the last few days. You could even carry small bags of scented herbs around with you, as a form of hygiene and social etiquette. Lavender, rosemary, and rose petals became not just a commodity, but a social shield. No one would ask you if you'd been to the latrine or had a bath recently if you smelled like a well-kept garden. But just in case lavender didn't quite do the trick, and it really didn't, people would go one step further and use a combination of spices like cinnamon, cloves, and myrrh. These ingredients were thought to be powerful enough to ward off disease, if not the disease itself, at least the stench of it. They didn't know about germs, but they sure knew about smell. So they came up with all kinds of concoctions, which included spiced wine, scented oils, and dried flowers. These were not only practical, they were fashionable too. Perfume wasn't just for avoiding the smell of death, It was about making yourself socially acceptable in a world where bathing was considered a luxury. Unfortunately, the use of perfumes didn't come without its own set of lies. Lavender, for all its delightful aroma, wasn't going to save you from the plague or any other serious disease. But as medieval people had no understanding of bacteria, they turned to herbal remedies and superstitions to solve problems they didn't understand. For example, people believed that garlic, a smelly and pungent herb, could ward off the plague. If you wore a garland of garlic or hung it around your house, the evil spirits would be repelled, and your home would remain free of disease. You didn't have to understand why garlic worked, you just had to believe that it would. Then there was the practice of carrying around posies, a mix of flowers and herbs stuffed into a small pouch that hung from your neck. This nosegay was meant to protect you from the terrible miasma around you, because clearly flowers had magical protective powers. Even when someone died of the plague right next to you, you could hang your posy, sniff your lavender, and feel like you were doing your part to fight off the disease. In reality, you were likely only succeeding in preventing people from noticing your complete lack of personal hygiene. But hey, that was a win, right? While lavender, garlic, and other aromatic herbs were the tools of choice in trying to avoid the stench of doom. As the centuries passed, newer, stranger ideas about how to treat disease emerged. In fact, some doctors believed that to combat the plague, you should bleed yourself out or even purge your body with a variety of questionable methods, such as applying leeches to your body. Unfortunately, the smell of lavender was never enough to counteract the fact that medieval medicine, for the most part, was, well, terrible. And still for many, the smell of lavender lingered, a comforting, if illusory, balm for the fears of disease, death, and the pervasive stench of medieval life. In the end, while the lavender might not have kept you from catching the plague, it at least made you smell like you were trying. The smell of progress, because sometimes you just need to smell the future to appreciate how far we've come. By now we've navigated the foul, disease-ridden streets of medieval life, dodged airborne waste, and learned how the creative, yet utterly misguided, use of lavender and garlic was considered cutting-edge hygiene. We've also witnessed the grim reality of communal latrines, the terrifying stench of the great unwashed, and the mind-bogglingly grotesque habits people employed to stave off what was inevitably a life of constant bodily contamination. So it's only fitting that we finish this journey by taking a good hard look at the smell of progress. And by that I mean the somewhat slow, very painful, and occasionally laughable transition from medieval hygiene practices to the cleaner, if not always cleanly, modern world. Let's be clear, the concept of hygiene didn't exactly explode into existence overnight. In fact, progress was more of a gentle nudge forward, like a very smelly boat with no rudder trying to find its way upstream. Every so often someone would have an epiphany, like, maybe, just maybe, we should wash ourselves once in a while. But these moments were few and far between, and often greeted with the same enthusiasm as discovering a new plague. And while we may joke about medieval hygiene, it's hard to deny that the world slowly, awkwardly, and uncomfortably began to improve, not just in the realm of cleanliness, but also in health, sanitation, and eventually common sense. So let's take a moment to appreciate how, despite centuries of bizarre beliefs, personal neglect, and public health disasters, a cleaner future was on the horizon. though it would take a while to arrive and smell the roses. Somewhere between the overflowing latrines and the sudden rise of plague-related superstitions, see garlic necklaces, medieval folk were starting to realise that hygiene was in fact important. But naturally, the leap from bathhouses are for peasants to maybe we should bathe regularly wasn't an easy one. This concept had to be fought for, sometimes literally. The first major hurdle in the quest for cleanliness came in the form of religion. You see, the church, in its infinite wisdom, had decided that bathing was a sinful activity. Why? Well, lust. Bathing was considered a frivolous pursuit that distracted people from their godly duties. And since most medieval folk didn't have the luxury of private baths, or personal privacy for that matter, the church stepped in to make sure things didn't get too wild. Eventually, the church softened its stance, probably after realizing that an entire population, smelling like a decaying herd of goats, wasn't exactly conducive to getting people to, show up to mass. And so, over time, the first bathhouses began to make a comeback in some parts of Europe. Still, these bathhouses were typically shared by the public, and their cleanliness, much like everything else in medieval life, was highly questionable. As bathing became somewhat fashionable again, the next problem arose. What was the purpose of bathing? Cleansing? Health benefits? No, not really. The first few centuries of the revival of bathing were mostly concerned with the rituals of cleanliness. The idea of getting clean was largely irrelevant to most bathers. Instead, the focus was more on socializing while attempting to get rid of as much dirt as possible. Bathhouses, like so many other things in medieval society, were places of chaos, sort of like a medieval version of a frat party, but with more open sores and fewer clean towels. But the biggest reason people took baths at all wasn't necessarily to become clean, it was simply because they had to. Cleanliness was still a vague and largely theoretical concept. If you were lucky, you might encounter some basic soap made from animal fat and ash, which, spoiler alert, didn't exactly do wonders for your skin. But for the most part, washing was more about the experience than the end result. For most of medieval history, personal hygiene wasn't about freshness, it was about survival. Why bother with soap and water when you were much more concerned about surviving the next famine or dodging yet another bout of plague? The return of public hygiene, the bathhouses and their decline. Ah yes, the bathhouses, those soaked and slippery realms where you might clean your body, but at the cost of your dignity. Public baths were great in theory. They were social hubs where you could chat, scrub off some of the filth you'd accumulated, and hope not to get infected by someone else's bad decisions. But unfortunately, the bathhouses were about as sanitary as a rat's nest in a pile of wet hay. They were communal, which meant that people shared water and sometimes towels. This should have been a red flag, but it wasn't. It wasn't just the dirty water that was the problem either. No, bathhouses were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Plague, lice, syphilis, and other uninvited guests could spread quickly in the warm, damp air. Bathhouses, much like the medieval world itself, were a perfect storm of filth. But for those who could afford it, they were an oasis of cleanliness in an otherwise hostile world. You'd emerge from the steaming pools, smelling slightly better, and perhaps a little less riddled with lice, although that depended on how lucky you were. Sadly, it wasn't long before the authorities began to close down these bathhouses during the Black Death. While the authorities had no real understanding of germs, they figured that crowding people into public baths where disease could be passed around freely probably wasn't the best way to handle a plague. Ironically, people's attempt to clean themselves had become a new method of spreading disease, and so the bathhouses were shuttered, and personal hygiene, yet again, took a backseat to more urgent matters, like, well, dying. Despite the bathhouse collapse, there was a gradual shift toward cleaner living over the next few centuries. The Renaissance gave way to the Enlightenment, and with it, new scientific theories on health and disease began to surface, which eventually led to the realization that germs existed. This, however, was a discovery that came much too late for many. It took until the 19th century for people to get serious about hygiene. Fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, and we're on the cusp of a revolution in sanitation. The basic principles of modern hygiene began to trickle down into the public consciousness. One of the more groundbreaking inventions to arrive was the flush toilet, which was basically a throne that finally allowed you to sit comfortably while you did your business without fearing the dreaded pit of communal waste. This was a massive leap forward, as people had previously been relying on a variety of methods, from simple chamber pots to elaborate sewer systems that often flooded into streets. But with the arrival of the flush toilet, people had the option to sit on actual seats, which was a luxury that medieval peasants never even dreamed of. But let's not get too excited too soon. The transition from medieval filth to modern cleanliness was a slow crawl, akin to a long, slow wave of progress. It wasn't just the toilets. It was the development of sewer systems, the understanding of clean drinking water, and the eventual advent of soap that moved hygiene into something more like what we understand today. People were finally starting to wash regularly, and we were on our way to a world where hygiene wasn't considered a joke, just something people did before lunch. By the 20th century, hygiene had officially entered the realm of the non-negotiable. Soap was a household staple, deodorant became a must-have item, and the once simple task of washing your hands was finally seen as a public health necessity. But as we look back at the grotesque path that led us here, one thing is clear. We owe our modern-day cleanliness to centuries of mistakes, superstition, and absurd attempts at solving problems no one even knew existed. And so, the next time you wash your hands with a soap that smells like lavender, no longer deadly, remember the long and painful road humanity walked to get here. It wasn't always pretty, but it was progress nonetheless.